The sea had been quiet for 3 days. No waves broke against the pilings. No wind moved across the surface. It lay flat and pale, like glass that had forgotten what reflection was for. And along the length of the pier, splintered, salt-eaten, and gray as bone, a crow walked. His claws clicked softly on the wood. Each step echoed longer than it should have, carrying into the still air and coming back unchanged. He stopped once, head tilted, the dull gleam of his eye catching the faint light. The air smelled not of salt, but of iron and rain that never came. He waited for movement, for sound, for tide. The sea came back fully that night. No wind, no thunder, no storm to announce it. Just the slow, relentless sound of water moving over what had once been dry. By dawn, the mist was gone, replaced by a dull silver haze that seemed to come from the sea itself. The pier, the one the crow had walked for years, was almost gone. Only the crane and the highest planks still showed above the tide, their reflections trembling on the water's surface. The crow sat on the last visible beam, feathers dark with spray. The air smelled of salt again, sharp, heavy, old. Beneath him the waves rolled and folded, the slow breathing of something ancient and tired. He looked down at the wood under his claws. The gaps between the planks had filled with water, each one now a narrow pool that reflected the sky. The sea had reclaimed the pier as quietly as it had abandoned it. Far off, near the road, the man returned again. His clothes were wet at the hem, his hair uncombed. He walked with care, testing each step on the slick boards. When he reached the place where the water met the wood, he stopped. "You did it," he said softly. "You came all the way back." His voice trembled in the stillness. The crow answered with a low, throaty call. The man crouched, touched the water, then stood again. The tide reached his boots, swirling around them like it wanted to pull him closer. He smiled without joy. "It's colder than I remember," he said. "Everything's colder now." He looked out across the flooded bay. The cannery was half submerged, its metal roof glinting like wet stone, its walls leaning with the weight of memory. The power poles that once led inland now ended in the sea, their wires dipping beneath the waves like roots, searching for something lost. The crow flapped his wings and flew down, circling the man once before landing on a piling near him. The wood groaned beneath his weight, soft and soaked through. The man watched him, then said, "You're still here. You must know something I don't." The crow only blinked, his reflection rippling below. A faint sound came from the horizon. Not thunder, not wind, but movement. The sea wasn't just returning now, it was spreading. The man turned toward the sound, his expression unreadable. "It's not done yet," he said. The tide rose another inch. Water slipped over the pier boards, covering the places where he had walked, where the crow had waited. The man stepped backward, higher up, until there was nowhere left to go. Behind him, the land was a thin line of mud and stone. Before him, the sea stretched endlessly, gray and alive. He looked down at his reflection, broken by ripples. "Guess it doesn't need us anymore," he said. The crow called once, the sound sharp and final. Then he took off, wings beating the wet air, flying low over the flooded pier. Below him, the water swallowed the last edge of wood, turning everything into a single surface of light. The man stood there until it reached his knees. Then, his shape blurred in the haze, a dark figure half merged with the returning sea. When the crow turned back, the man was gone. Only the crane remained, rusted and half-drowned, its arm reaching toward the horizon like it was asking for the storm to answer. The crow landed on its highest point and looked down. Beneath him, the water shimmered with quiet motion, swallowing the noise of the world. The tide had finally turned, not with fury, but with patience. And in that patience, everything that had waited, the sea, the pier, the silence, finally remembered what it meant to move again. When the tide pulled back, it didn't return to where it belonged. It went farther inland, filling ditches, roads, and hollows that hadn't seen salt water in generations. The pier was gone completely now. Nothing remained above the surface but the bent arm of the crane and the crow who would not leave it. The morning light was thin and white. Everything else, air, water, horizon, had blended into one long silence. The crow's reflection stretched beneath him, steady and dark, until a ripple bent it out of shape. He watched it reform, patient as always. The sea had taken back the world, but it was quieter than anyone imagined it would be. On the far ridge, where dry ground still held its breath, the man stood. His boots were caked with silt, his clothes stiff from salt. He looked down at what used to be the bay, though it was now too large, too strange to name. The cannery roof was gone, the water shimmered where it had been. He couldn't see the pier anymore, but he knew where it was. Under the surface, under time. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, though he didn't know what for. "Hey!" The word went nowhere. It broke against the air and vanished like foam. The only sound that answered was a single, distant caw. He looked up. The crow circled the old crane once, then twice, black against gray. "Still there," the man murmured. "Guess one of us should be." He started down the slope toward the waterline. The ground was soft, each step sinking deep, leaving dark impressions that filled slowly with water. When he reached the edge, he hesitated. The sea moved like breath, slow in, slow out, carrying the smell of iron and driftwood. He crouched and touched it. The cold bit into his skin, sharper than before. He whispered, "You're not done, are you?" The crow landed nearby, close enough that the man could hear the faint scrape of claws on stone. The bird looked at him, head tilted, feathers puffed slightly against the wind. For a moment they stayed that way, two survivors of a world that had gone still too long and was now moving again in the wrong direction. The man sighed, sat down on the wet earth, and leaned back on his hands. "It's funny," he said. "When the tide left, I thought everything was ending. Now that it's back, it still feels like an ending." The crow called once, short and low, then spread his wings. He flew low across the new shore, his shadow breaking against the reflected light. The man followed his flight with his eyes, until the black shape vanished against the horizon. Then he stood, stepped into the water, and began to walk. The sea didn't resist him. It folded around his legs as if it had been waiting. He waded deeper, the cold climbing to his knees, his waist. When he looked down, he could almost see the ghost of the pier beneath him. Faint outlines in the water, boards, nails, a shape the sea hadn't finished erasing. He whispered, "I guess nothing ever leaves for good." The crow came back, circling above him once more. The man stopped and looked up. "You can stay," he said. "You always could." Then he turned toward the horizon and kept walking. The water rose until it met his chest. The tide moved around him, slow and endless, pulling at his coat, his voice, his name. The crow's call faded into distance. The man didn't look back. By the time the sun reached its height, the water had smoothed over completely. Only the faintest ripple showed where he had been. The crow landed again on the crane, now just the topmost curve of rust, above the endless surface. He stayed there all day, silent. When evening came, the sky turned copper, and the reflection of the dying light trembled in the water. The sea was still. The pier was gone. The world had moved on. But the crow stayed, black against the glow, the last keeper of a place that had finally remembered what it was to drown. But the water below didn't breathe. At the far end of the pier stood a rusted crane, its cables hanging slack, its gears locked forever in the act of lowering something that never touched the sea. The crow hopped closer, wings half spread for balance. Beneath him, between the cracks in the planks, he could see what the water had left behind. Ropes like veins, barnacles clinging to empty space, fish bones pale as driftwood. The sea had withdrawn years ago, they said. Not vanished, not died, just stopped coming in. Even the gulls had left. Only the crows remained. Onshore, the old cannery stood hollow, its windows blown out, its metal roof sagging like a tired shoulder. Grass grew through the asphalt of the loading yard, pushing through cracks that once carried trucks and voices and life. A man moved among the ruins. He was old, gray-bearded, his jacket torn at the sleeve, and he carried a bucket, though there was nothing left to gather. He had once worked here, though the building didn't remember him. The crow watched him from the crane. The man stopped near the base of the pier and looked up. "Still here, huh?" he said. His voice was thin but not unkind. Guess it's yours now. The crow shifted, head turning side to side, then gave a low rasp that might have been an answer. The man smiled. Figures. You birds never leave. Smarter than the rest of us. He set the bucket down and sat beside it, staring out at the motionless sea. You know, he said, not looking up, they used to say the tide had a heartbeat, always came back, no matter what we did. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a cigarette. It was bent and soft with moisture, but he lit it anyway. The flame hissed in the damp air. Now listen, he said. The crow did. There was nothing to hear. No gulls, no waves, no wind. Only silence, thick and patient. The man laughed once, quietly. Guess it died too. The crow hopped down from the crane and landed on the pier beside him. He watched the ember of the cigarette glow faintly in the gray. The man looked at him, smoke curling around his face. Funny thing, he said. When the water left, so did time. Days just stay. Nothing turns over anymore. He tapped the ash into the bucket. You ever notice that? The crow tilted his head. The man smiled again, but it was the tired smile of someone talking just to prove he still could. Didn't think so. You're better off. When he left the bucket behind. The crow waited until the man's footsteps faded among the ruins. Then he hopped to the rim of the bucket and looked inside. It was empty, except for a few flakes of ash and a reflection of the sky. The crow stared at it for a long time, unsure of what he saw was above or below. The air smelled faintly of smoke and rain. He spread his wings once, shook the water from his feathers, and let the silence settle again. The sea didn't rise. The tide didn't turn. Only the crow moved, black against gray, walking the length of a pier that no longer belonged to water. The rain came without warning. It began as a mist that hung low over the ruined cannery, then grew into a steady fall that soaked the wood and made the air smell like salt again. The crow sat on the rusted crane, feathers slick, eyes bright. He watched the water gather in the grooves of the pier, filling its cracks and knots until it looked almost alive again. Each drop landed with the smallest sound, soft enough to be mistaken for breathing. Down below, the man came back. He had no coat this time, only a heavy shirt that clung to his shoulders. His hair was wet, his boots left deep prints in the mud. He went straight to the bucket he had left days ago, now half full of rainwater. He stared at it for a while, then laughed softly, as if the sight was both gift and mockery. Didn't think it'd find use again, he said. The crow flew down, landing near him. The man didn't flinch. He looked up instead, squinting through the rain. You again, he said. You really like this place, don't you? The crow cawed once, sharp and hollow. The man smiled. Guess that's a yes. He lifted the bucket, tipped it slightly, watching the water swirl inside. You hear that? He said quietly. It's moving. Can you believe that? Moving. The crow tilted his head, following the man's gaze to the sea. The rain had darkened it, drawn faint lines where the drops struck the surface. The tide still hadn't turned, but something was shifting. Not waves exactly, just small tremors, like the ocean remembering how to stir. The man stood on the edge of the pier, rainwater running down his face. Used to come in strong right here, he said. Back when this place worked, back when the boats still had names. He glanced down at the bucket again, then at the horizon. You think it's trying? The crow hopped closer, claws scratching the wet wood. Lightning flickered far off, too distant to sound. The man watched it, shoulders rising and falling with slow breath. If it comes back, he said, I'll go with it. Don't care where. The crow blinked. The man turned the bucket over, emptying the rain back into the cracks of the pier. The water ran along the grooves, joined with the puddles, and then slipped between the boards into the dark. For a moment, it looked as though the sea was drinking it. Thunder rolled then, low, uncertain, like an old voice clearing its throat. The crow took flight, wings slicing through the air, circling once above the pier. The man didn't move. He stood still, looking at the horizon, where the faintest curve of a wave began to rise. Not a real one, not yet, but enough to bend the reflection of the sky. The crow landed again beside him, feathers shining like wet coal. The man laughed, the sound almost lost to the wind. "Guess it remembers," he said. "Took its time, though." The tide didn't rush in that night. It crept, inch by inch, silent, heavy, cautious. By the time the man left, the water had climbed to the first row of pilings. The crow stayed longer, perched on the crane, watching the dark surface shimmer. When morning came, the bucket was gone, washed from the pier by a tide too slow to notice itself returning. The crow stared at the empty space where it had been, then at the faint trail of foam lapping against the wood. The sea hadn't forgiven anything. It had simply remembered.